I'm Loren Bawn. I'm the operations manager with the Iowa Bureau of Refugee Services. We serve as the state coordinator for the state of Iowa for refugee matters. States are organized differently around how they administer their refugee services. Some states have a strong state coordinator office. Some states elect to have most of that state coordinator work done by nonprofit organizations. Here in Iowa, we've had a strong state coordinator's office since the mid-1970s. We've enjoyed strong bipartisan support for a strong state-oriented refugee program, which we've been really pleased that, through several administrations, we've maintained that commitment for Iowa to welcome refugees to our state. The reality that refugees face is the assistance that is provided from the federal government doesn't come close to helping with everything a refugee family needs to move toward economic self-sufficiency, as we call it in refugee work. So we are thrilled when groups like this come together to coordinate, to talk about the different services they have available, because we do find refugee families do need a mix of services to really begin their journey toward really reaching their full potential. Help with childcare, help with transportation, help with, what does this mean? What is this like 6-page letter I get from the government telling me I must do? So all of these things, when we have community groups that help with these things, that want to extend those kinds of services to refugee families, we're glad to help. We work with employers all over the state who are looking for great refugee workers. Iowa has been for about as long as I've been in the business, which is going on a couple decades now, has been a net magnet for refugees who were originally resettled elsewhere. This is something we see particularly in the Iowa City area. In the vernacular, we call such refugees secondary migrants because they were originally resettled in another part of the country and decided to move to Iowa. So good on us, you know. We are able to attract refugees who are initially resettled in other states, and they're able to, we hope, begin to build great lives here in Iowa. We know a lot of our food processors here in Iowa, a lot of our hospitality industry here in Iowa relies on refugee workers. Many of them are open to how do we make our workplace more attractive to refugees? How do we welcome more refugee workers? And that's a great thing. We're glad to help with that. We're glad to help with agencies that are serving refugees and that are, are there cultural practices, are there tools to provide appropriate language access? Do we need to look at our intake, our enrollment systems to see, are they culture and language appropriate? Are we, really extending our services into refugee communities as effectively as we could? Because we know every time a refugee family finds something that helps with some need they have, that's a wonderful thing. And when groups like this are willing to come together and just kind of coordinate, understand what each other's doing, then you'll know. If you're working with a refugee family, you'll know, oh, they have a need in this area. Let me call this agency. I know they help with such things. And then we bring the kind of galaxy of services that would best help that family move toward their goals together, so that we're not, kind of treating every little piece of their life in isolation. So good on you. Very good that you come together like this, that you have these discussions. And here at the Bureau, we have a new Bureau Chief, Mark Sucheska. I've known Mark for many years. I came to Iowa as a child refugee with his family, and has had a heart for refugee work, pretty much his whole life. Before coming to the Bureau, he was working with the United Way, and he was a key part of starting the discussions about, can we find an alternative to an American high school credential for refugees who have the knowledge but don't have the piece of paper to prove it. So I know there have been some discussions in the legislature. The most recent change in that area was the shift from GED to what they call HiSET. And we offer at the Bureau, we do offer some classroom instruction for refugees who are wanting to pursue a HiSET credential. And the main concern, I think, with encouraging more refugees to get American education credentials is they have to work. They have to work. And many refugees end up working in places where there might be an hour commute, or they might have to van pool or ride share to work. So between work, possibly a second job, all of these things, that may take up half or more of their day, 5 days a week, sometimes 6, if they're getting a lot of overtime. And then they're expected to figure out everything about life in America. And if you're talking about a single mom with 3, 4, 5 children, imagine the challenge she's facing in a completely foreign culture, needing to work that takes her away 10, 12 hours a day, and then trying to figure out everything else about American life, make sure her children are cared for, schools, things happen, sick children get to the doctor, all of those things. So it's, refugees face a lot of challenges once they get here. But in order to face those challenges, they need to get here. We had a presidential declaration, which is the lowest it's ever been. So the presidential declaration is something that happens every year. The president determines how many refugees will be allowed in the United States for the coming federal fiscal year, which begins on October 1st every year. So for this federal fiscal year, which just started, presidential determination was 18,000. That's the lowest it's ever been. The historical average over the years is about 95,000 per year. The United States can easily handle 100,000. We've handled as many as 250,000 in a year in the past. 18,000 after the terrorist attacks of 9/11. The program was essentially shut down for 2 years. We lost about a third of the Bureau staff after that tragedy. And none of the terrorists who committed those horrible acts came as refugees. The refugee program is the one immigration stream the federal government has absolute control over. Other types of visas, other types of entries, as we're seeing in the southern border, the government does not have as much control over. 18,000, and my point about mentioning 9/11 was even in the 2 years following 9/11, we resettled over 20,000 refugees because there's a pipeline. It takes a long time for refugees overseas to, one, find their way to a UN-sponsored camp or office to say, hey, I had to flee my country of birth, I can't return because I will be persecuted or killed. I just ask people, just imagine, what if some group that you belong to, maybe your church, maybe some civic group, maybe someone would decide blonde-haired people are bad for us or something. And to just suddenly find yourself defined as someone who doesn't belong in the land you were born in. I mean, imagine what that must feel like. And imagine if soldiers with guns are coming to enforce that you don't belong in the country you were born in, your parents were born in, their parents were born in. What would you do? What can you do other than run for your life? And if you manage to find safety, cross the border and find some small safety, what do you do? What do you do then? And historically, the United States has had a very strong commitment to helping. Up until the last few years, the United States permanently resettled more refugees every year than the rest of the world combined. Now, there are other countries that are sheltering many, many, many more refugees than that, but those refugees do not have a full set of human rights in that country where they are being sheltered. So they may not be able to take a job. They may not be able to go far from the confines of a refugee camp. And the refugee camps are, you know, it's probably not somewhere those of us who spent our entire lives in the United States would consider a home. You know, yet we know we have refugees coming to Iowa who were born in a refugee camp because it's taken so long to deal with the conflict that forced them to flee. And you know, some of these conflicts, there will never be a resolution. There are 60 to 80 million displaced people in the world today. The UN makes a distinction between a refugee, which is someone who is outside their country, and an internally displaced person, somebody who maybe had to flee their city because their city is being bombed, but they were still able to find somewhere within their country. And then there are about 3 million, what the UN considers stateless people. There is no country that claims, yes, these are our people, and this is their homeland. So conflict and displacement are a huge and sad reality in our world today. And you know, some of us who have been in refugee work for a while are still committed to doing our small part to try to help and to say, if you have had to flee this kind of horror and you can go through the 2 to 5 year process to be checked to see if you're acceptable to the United States, we want to help you build a good life here. We want to, one of the things I talk about is we want each of us to be the bridge. Because in my work, I work with interpreters a lot. And not often, but every now and then, an interpreter will turn to me and will say, this will take a little longer to interpret. We don't have that concept in our culture. And think about that for a minute. There are thoughts we can't even have because of our cultural background, because of our cultural upbringing. So what greater way to learn about the world, to expand your possibilities, than to interact with people and find those concepts that are just not shared across culture, and to explore that. We talk about innovation here in the United States, and we all want to be innovative. We want to find new and better ways of doing things. We want to build new and better products. We want to find more efficient ways of getting assistance to people. What better way to innovate? I mean, what is innovation? You need to look at current problems with new eyes. what better way to look at something with new eyes than to welcome people who have very different perspectives, very different understandings, to welcome them to our tables and to engage in these kind of discussions, these kinds of group efforts. It's how we innovate. It's how we grow. I know the work we've done and our dedication to refugee programs, to allowing asylum seekers to be treated the way international treaties, our Constitution, and all of those things require. We know that has made us a stronger nation. We know that makes us a better people. You know, my grandparents were, on one side, were of Irish background, on the other side were of Portuguese background. And my parents, you know, they were second generation immigrants to the United States. And by third generation, myself, I'm pretty much the all-American boy. So, you know, one of the things I occasionally mention is we are a nation of mutts from all over, because love is never the wrong thing to do. And if people from very different cultures find each other and find love for each other, this is a beautiful thing. So how do we help make those connections? And for those of us who are native-born Americans, yeah, I do think it does fall to us to start that bridge, to show we are trying to build this bridge. We want to welcome you. We want to, you know, we'll get the bridge as close to your shore as we can. If you can meet us, then we will have a bridge between these two cultures. We will all grow. We will all be better for that effort. So 18,000 will be tough, and there will be a lot of refugee serving agencies around the country that close. Refugee resettlement programs in particular are extremely sensitive to that number, because they are paid based on how many people they are able to resettle. So these will be very challenging times for our friends at Macaulay Center, for our friends at USCRI Des Moines, for our friends at Catholic Charities in Des Moines, and for our friends all over the state who may be just a small nonprofit resettling 1 or 2 refugees a year under the auspices of one of the national resettlement programs. So I guess for all of us, the job is be as welcoming as we can. Certainly express concerns about this 18,000 number, which, I mean, if we take the 20 to 25,000 that were processed, even when the program was shut down, there's much concern that 18,000 is below what in government we call maintenance of effort, because there's obviously a lot of infrastructure required to do all the security vetting, to do all of the things that must happen before a refugee can be approved to travel to the United States. Below about 20,000, it's hard to imagine that infrastructure remaining in place if a future administration would move that number to a more historically appropriate level. There was also an executive order issued at the same time as the presidential declaration, which, at least according to the language of the order, gives states and communities more authority to reject refugee programs. There are questions about the constitutionality of that executive order. As you know, a state government employee, I can't really talk about what we should do regarding that executive order. But I do keep coming back to the fact that Iowa, since the mid-1970s, has had very strong bipartisan support. The governor issued a proclamation this year on World Refugee Day, just reminding Iowans of how important the refugee program is to Iowa. And so I think the more we can let our friends, neighbors, representatives know, we believe in Iowa's commitment to refugees. We want Iowa to continue to be welcoming to refugees. You know, that will certainly